to make a donation, or, censure him some way financially, because blokes think like that, apparently. And he can make a donation to something like, hey, what about Women's Refuge?
It'll be interesting to Fliss. Thank you. It'll be interesting to see how it goes tomorrow. As I said before, Fliss Butcher on the panel. Oh, do you want to add something, Gary?
Yeah, no, that's right. No, I'll talk to Fliss there. That's fine. But here's a problem we've got now. Men are reluctant to defend themselves in any area at all. I mean, I don't want anybody out there listening to me now to think that I'm saying that all that stuff in Hollywood and Trump and all those bullies and disregarding the odd idiot like this fellow Bunting. But here's the thing that's a problem. There are women who go into bars and grab guys by the crutch. This is not uncommon. And I'm sure, Verity, you'll be honest enough to admit that this does happen.
I've never heard of that happening, but...
Seriously, you haven't?
No. I mean, never. Like, it happens at,
really?
like, strip clubs occasionally, but I've never seen it in a bar.
Oh, okay. Well, take my word for it, it does happen.
Okay. Christchurch, man.
So what I'm worried about here is, okay, now, if a man complained about that and made an issue, I suppose the same amount of fuss would happen, would it? But I suspect it won't. And I'm just a wee bit worried that things are getting a little out of balance here. Some guys are intimidated by women, and some women are very direct in the things they say to guys, and some guys are embarrassed about it. We discussed this at the radio station where I worked the other day. I'm just not sure that men have got any comeback anymore. And it's the idea of having some sort of training course for counsellors, male counsellors, as part of this problem. Will men be able to talk about anything? Will men be able to bring these issues up? Will women counsellors have to go on courses? I don't know.
I think, you raise an interesting point. Yeah, I'm really good friends with a male stripper, and he said that a lot of the time he's felt really intimidated by some of the actions women take towards him. So I think, there are occasions when women do things to men which make them feel uncomfortable or intimidated. But the part of the discussion is about everybody admitting to, say, this behaviour. And I don't think women do it as much as men do. I think women might occasionally do it, but I think there's a really endemic culture, especially in office places, and people ask anyone who works in HR how many times they deal with sexual harassment of men to women. But yeah, you're right, men should totally be allowed to express these feelings, and part of sexism is that men feel like they can't talk about being upset, and part of sexism is that women feel like they do get harassed. So it's kind of the same problem, what you're talking about, and I feel like when we admit that patriarchy, to drop the patriarchy word, puts unfair expectations on men and on women, and both of us have to go through a lot of rubbish stuff because of gender and the expectations around that. But do I think that we should have a training course for counsellors? I 100% think we should. Not necessarily because every man is doing this, not because everyone's a real awful person, but because nice guys have a responsibility in calling out this behaviour in the creeps that they see in the office, because nice guys will see creeps being creeps and they won't say anything about it because they'll be like, oh, no, it's just him being a creep. But they should call out his behaviour, and nice guys have a responsibility to do that.
All right, Gary, last riposte? Or not a riposte, the last comment.
I appreciate what Verity just said, as I did before when she said something to me before, but I think that's very, very right. And I just don't want New Zealand to become the place where the guys are now too afraid to say about things that bother them. That's it.
Well, that is it, actually. That's all we've got time for the day.
What a note to finish on.
Well, that's right. Okay,
I enjoyed that, Verity.
Thanks, man. Always a pleasure.
It was an interesting panel. Gary McCormick, thank you for coming on. Always a pleasure to have you on.
Cheers. Thanks, Jim.
And Verity Johnson, glad to have you make your debut. Come back.
Oh, thank you, sir.
That's us for another day. Thanks, everybody. Checkpoints with John Campbell coming right up.
Kia ora everyone, a huge program tonight. Pike River families celebrate as the Supreme Court rules a decision not to lay charges against former mine boss Peter Whittle after a payment of money was unlawful. We're joined by Anna Osborne, and with her is Nigel Hampton QC, who took the case to the Supreme Court. It's an extraordinary interview. It's coming up. Also tonight, Waikato DHB's former CEO tells us Nigel Murray abused his position when he racked up more than $200,000 in expenses in 3 years. That too is a fascinating interview. Papua New Guinea police, soldiers and government officials have moved into the decommissioned Manus Island detention centre. The jury in the Hurimoana Dennis kidnap trial finds him not guilty. The All Whites coach steps down, and it's 33 degrees in Cromwell.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, good afternoon. Ko Katrina Batanaho. The Supreme Court has ruled that WorkSafe's decision not to prosecute the Pike River mine boss Peter Whittle over the deaths of 29 miners was unlawful. However, the length of time that has passed since the 2010 explosion means he will not face further court action. WorkSafe initially laid 12 health and safety charges against Mr Whittle, but they were dropped after more than $3 million was paid to the victims' families. In 2015, Anna Osborne, whose husband died in the blast, described the insurance payout as blood money and said she believed Mr Whittle would eventually be charged. She and Sonia Rockhouse, who lost a son in the explosion, fought a lengthy legal battle through the High Court and Court of Appeal before being granted permission to take a case to the country's highest court, seeking a declaration that the dropping of charges arose from an unlawful bargain. In a judgment released this afternoon, the court agreed with them. The minister responsible for Pike River re-entry, Andrew Little, says while the families of the miners have been vindicated by the court's decision, those responsible have got away scot-free. He says in reality no further prosecutions are likely to take place.
Under the health and safety legislation, they are time barred. You have to do it within a period of time after the events giving rise to the prosecution. Whether there are other grounds for prosecution under other legislation, including the Crimes Act, it seems pretty remote that anything further could happen.
Andrew Little says, however, the Pike River re-entry project could allow for new evidence, including forensic evidence, to be gathered from the mine. Sonia Rockhouse, whose son Ben Rockhouse was killed, says the ruling is at the very least a moral victory and shows that justice can't be bought.
But I think that it will set a precedent so that in the future this can never happen again. So when charges are laid, they actually have to be followed through with. You can't pay an amount of money and get away with it.
Sonia Rockhouse. A senior police officer acquitted on charges of kidnapping a teenager says 2 years of stress and worry have been lifted off his shoulders. Inspector Hurimoana Dennis and a fellow officer, Sergeant Vaughan Perry, were found not guilty in the High Court in Auckland this afternoon. Charges were brought against the two men after the then 17-year-old said they searched him, locked him in a cell and told him if he didn't move to Australia and forget about his underage girlfriend, he would be charged with statutory rape. Outside the court, Mr Dennis said there were things going on in the two families involved that greatly scared him and he just wanted to help.
That's why I got out of bed, to help a very, very good family who all they wanted to do was to protect their moko and their tamaiti and these two kids, nothing more, nothing less. In actual fact, this was the young man's point of difference. He actually had a family that cared. A lot of our Māori men who come into the judicial system skate on their own.
Hurimoana Dennis. The entire town of Taupō is without power. Transpower says 16,000 properties have been affected since about 1:30 this afternoon. Some businesses have been forced to close. The lines company Unison says electricity should be restored early this evening. It says there was a problem during routine maintenance at a substation. The National Party says the government's tax working group looks like a 10-month-long rubber stamp for a capital gains tax. Labor has unveiled the terms of reference for the group, which will be chaired by the former Finance Minister Sir Michael Cullen. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Chris Bramwell.
The tax working group will not consider any increase in income tax or the rate of GST, but taxes on land and capital gains will be looked at, though none that would affect the family home. National's finance spokesperson Stephen Joyce says the whole group has been set up to deliver the Finance Minister Grant Robertson the recommendation of a capital gains tax. He says there's no pretence at the independence of the group, with the appointment of Sir Michael as chair. Sir Michael rejects that, saying the report will be totally independent, just as the one he did on the intelligence agencies was for the previous government. Atuiti whare pārimata, ko Chris Bramalaho.
The central Otago town of Cromwell has hit its hottest spring temperature on record today, 33.3 degrees. That's a degree higher than the previous record set in 2010. A NIWA meteorologist Ben Knoll says inland parts of Otago, Southland and Canterbury have been particularly hot recently as an early summer unfolds with the La Nina conditions bringing 30-degree plus temperatures to some places. Fourth generation Cromwell fruit grower Simon Webb says in the 40 years he's lived there, he has never experienced weather this hot in November.
It's just blue skies and calm and you can feel the burn in the sun. It's really, really hot. We only swam in the lake a couple of times last year, and we've done it 3 or 4 times already.
Simon Webb says people in town are talking about how it feels like February weather. The plant disease myrtle rust has been found in the Auckland region for the first time. The fungus harms trees in the myrtle family, including native species such as Pohutukawa, Manuka and Rata. It was first discovered in Northland in May, and several cases have since been confirmed in Taranaki, Waikato and the Bay of Plenty. The Ministry for Primary Industry says the latest find is at a commercial plant production site at Waimoku. Hundreds of ramarama plants there are affected. It's 5:05. To sport, and New Zealand football have been unable to convince All Whites coach Anthony Hudson to carry on. Hudson stepping down following last week's failed World Cup qualifying attempt against Peru. The 36-year-old hasn't announced where he's going, but he has been linked to a deal with American Major League Soccer club, the Colorado Rapids. The chief executive of New Zealand football, Andy Martin, was confident Hudson would re-sign when he offered him a contract extension last month.
I thought we were going to announce before Peru. That's what I was hoping to happen. But clearly in that period of time, his head's been turned because he's put himself on the map. And I think once that happened, we knew we were going to lose him. That was the unfortunate thing. We're not going to compete with one of the top clubs that he's looking at.
Andy Martin. England recovered from an early setback to reach 59 for 1 at lunch on the opening day of the Ashes cricket series against Australia in Brisbane. Alistair Cook fell cheaply for 2, but Mark Stoneham and James Vince showed plenty of defiance in their Ashes debuts. The pair built a 57-run partnership at the break after England won the toss and elected to bat. Rain has delayed the resumption of play after lunch. And the Tall Blacks begin their quest for a place at the World Basketball Champs tonight when they play South Korea in Wellington. New Zealand is now part of the Asia qualifying process and will also have pool matches against China and Hong Kong. That's the news.
A victim recalls Rewa.
I had no doubt that he was capable of killing me. Capable of murder, period.
Justice finds the butcher of Bosnia.
In the end, in those final moments, he wasn't brave enough to face up to those crimes that he had committed.
Kiwi adventurer stabbed.
Oh, mate, I'm lucky to be alive, and I'm counted my blessings. Last night I got a message through my daughter, said she loved me. I just burst into tears.
An emotional roller coaster. Guy and Espina and Mihinarangi Forbes Morning Report weekdays from 6.
Then on 9 to noon, the new Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, Simon Upton, on why science should not be politicised. And after 10, the garden designer with Asperger's syndrome, on how he views the world differently to make beautiful creations. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Met service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Waitomo, Coromandel Peninsula, Bay of Plenty, Taupo, Taumaranui and Taihape. Also the ranges of Gisborne and Hawke's Bay. Mostly fine, isolated afternoon and evening showers, mainly inland. For the remainder of Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, also Taranaki to Wellington and Wairarapa. Fine apart from some areas of cloud, morning and night. For all of the South Island, fine apart from areas of cloud or fog morning and night, but cloudy areas lingering about coastal Canterbury and Otago tomorrow afternoon and evening. Also some isolated afternoon and evening showers inland, spreading to coastal Canterbury and Otago tomorrow evening. The Chatham Islands cloudy with occasional drizzle. It's 5:08 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina Batten, and thank you everyone for joining us. Coming up on the program tonight, an exclusive interview with the man who ran the Waikato DHB before Nigel Murray. We think it is fascinating. But we begin tonight with a Supreme Court judgment that is both a personal triumph and a much larger precedent. Perhaps in the long term, a judgment that won't change the way justice is done in New Zealand, but may prevent it from changing. This was the case Anna Osborne and Sonia Rockhouse took against WorkSafe New Zealand. Anna, who was widowed by the Pike River mine explosion 7 years ago to the day last Sunday. Sonia, who lost her son. Although a case against Pike River's CEO Peter Whittle was initially prepared, WorkSafe dropped it after Whittle agreed to pay over $3 million to the Pike families. This afternoon, the Supreme Court ruled, and I quote, "A declaration is made that the decision of WorkSafe New Zealand to offer no evidence in the prosecution of Peter William Whittle was unlawful." It was a victory for the two women who took the case, and it was a victory for Nigel Hampton QC, the lawyer who took the case, because he believed people with money shouldn't be able to buy their way out of prosecution. I spoke to him and on Anna Osborne just minutes after the decision was released.
I'm feeling pretty elated. We've got justice in the end.
Can you tell me about it? What does the decision say?
Well, it says that this was a bargain to stifle a prosecution and is unlawful.
And that was your argument all along, wasn't it?
That was the argument all along, John.
And so this is unequivocally and singularly a victory.
Oh, it sure is. It sure is. After being knocked back by three courts in the land, and to finally take it to the Supreme Court and win, and know that this decision was an unlawful decision made by MB to drop charges against Peter Whittle and to pay the victims some money is just not right. So it's a huge victory for the families, and I just am immensely proud of our wonderful legal team who have gotten us to where we are today, and also to remember Helen Kelly for the instigating this.
Why was this so important to you, Anna? Because because in a way, what WorkSafe was saying is, we simply can't handle this. We're not sure how we will go. And so here is something, families. Take this and go away. Why were you determined to not go away?
Because justice should not be bought in New Zealand, and that's what this was all about. You cannot, I'll use an example that was actually shared in the Supreme Court. A person who murdered somebody cannot go to that victim's family and say, well, I don't like the charge of murder against me. If I give you some money for this, will you drop the charges? And that's pretty much what this was. There's 29 men who went to work that day and were killed, and not one person had been held to account. And then WorkSafe thought it was safe and okay to do a backroom deal and put money in the family's bank accounts so that all charges were dropped against Peter Whittle. How unlawful is that?
Well, the Supreme Court says it is unlawful. Full stop. That's the Supreme Court.
Absolutely. So this is a monumental win for the families, our legal team, and hopefully for any other victim in New Zealand now, because the eyes will be on this case, and this will set a precedent for any other cases like this.
And that's the point, Nigel, you were making. This is not only a very particular and personal victory for Anna and Sonia, Anna who lost her husband, Sonia who lost her son, but Nigel, it is a very big victory in law, isn't it?
Well, it underlines a very important principle, which has existed a long, long time, and I never thought in my career in the law that I would ever see the day where a bargain where money is paid would end a prosecution. This puts finally away any suggestion that you can buy justice in our New Zealand system. It's a principled system. It is not a pragmatic system run on the basis of payment of money. Rich persons can pay their way out. That's not on. It's never been part of the common law and never should be.
Nigel, who went to who? Anna, who went to who? Did you, Nigel, approach the families, or did Anna, you approach Nigel?
Let's bring Helen Kelly into this as well, because Helen was our battler, and she saw that it stunk what happened in the beginning, and Nigel also. We all kept in close contact, and all of them actually turned around and says, hey, this is just not right. We cannot let this lie. Yeah.
I'll tell you what happened, John. I rather foolishly said in an email to Helen Kelly, let me know about some of this forestry stuff that you're trying to set up a few years ago now. And lo and behold, there was a file at my door about forestry matters, forestry safety, forestry deaths the same day. And then following on from that, she said, oh, look, Nigel, there's just one other small thing you could do for me. And that was it. That was the Anna and Sonia thing, and 3 years later, here we are at the end of that road. So that's really how it happened. I mean, I had knowledge of Pike River from acting for the miners' union during the Royal Commission inquiry. I didn't act for the families, but having all that knowledge that I'd acquired during the Royal Commission, it rolled on nicely to enable me to pick up the cudgels here, say to myself, there's something awful happened here, let's see if we can fix it.
And you have?
I think we've got a fair measure towards it, I think, Anna, haven't we?
You have totally nailed it. And from the family's perspective, oh my gosh, we are so blessed to have had you in our lives to walk this journey with us, and also to recognise Helen Kelly's tremendous work in all of this as well. So it's just a huge victory, and the smile on my face, well, hopefully you can tell by my voice, it's just huge. For this to happen now is just incredible, and it is, you know, I just feel like after all the crap that we put up with for the last 7 years, things are all starting to fall into place now, and, you know, my man might even be coming home.
Anna Osborne and Nigel Hampton QC speaking to us earlier. Later in the programme we're going to talk more to Nigel Hampton QC about the point of law that is at stake here and what this means as a precedent, because we think it is an important one. We tried to reach Peter Whittle at his new workplace in Sydney today. We were told he was there but wasn't available to come to the phone. Peter Whittle is never available to come to the phone. We have tried him many times. It is 16 minutes past 5. Auckland councillors have chosen a compromise option. This is breaking news for creating an America's Cup village, opting to spread bases over 3 wharves each of which will need small extensions. After a 3-hour meeting, councillors chose the $132 million option to build 8 bases across the Wynyard, Halsey Street and Hobson wharves. America's Cup reporter Todd Niall is at the council and joins us on the phone. This was the cheaper option and less invasive, Todd, in terms of its expansion into the harbour, right?
Yeah, less invasive, and this is the one that had been looking for the past week that it would come through. The big option, the initial preference for Team New Zealand was a 220-metre expansion of the Halsey Street Wharf. This one spreads the bases over 3 sort of adjacent wharves, and Halsey Street Wharf does get extended, but only by 75 metres at $132 million. This is also, of the really viable options, the cheapest one. And there was a burst of almost consensus towards the end. Team New Zealand had always publicly favoured the bigger, more expensive option, but Stephen Tindall told meeting in a question and answer session with councillors that they accepted the reality of the more modest, the less contentious model, and so the team has agreed that they can work with that one.
Gosh, that's fascinating because, as you said, that wasn't their initial preference. So Stephen Tindall was there and there was a Q&A with council, and in the end he said, yes, we will take this.
Yeah, so for Stephen Tindall, who's on the board, and also Kevin Shoebridge, Chief Operating Officer, sat side by side with council officials as council has talked and asked, why this, why that, how something would work. And yes, they conceded that so Stephen Tindall himself said he personally had some of the concerns that Aucklanders did around encroachment into the harbour. He accepted the political reality of trying to push through the big option, and also acknowledged that the lower cost of doing the compromise one was probably also a significant factor.
Todd, is this a done deal now then? Is this going to happen, or is there more work yet to be done?
It's essentially a done deal. What they now take away is this is the political decision. The Mayor, the Chief Executive, now has to sit down with Team New Zealand and with the government to hammer out formal agreements on this option, to discuss how the cost sharing will be done. And this then comes back to the Council on the 14th of December for absolute sign-off. Theoretically, there's still another option in the mix, and it's stayed in there because it's one the government had wanted to look at, but it's really got quite a few fishhooks in it and is there only in spirit, if you like, rather than as a viable second option. So essentially, this is it.
Todd Niall, our Auckland reporter, thanks so much. So Auckland councillors have chosen that compromise option. It seems supported by Team New Zealand. That Just breaking this afternoon, 5:19. A former Waikato DHB CEO says the man who took over from him has abused his position, both in terms of expenditure and the excessive time he spent away from the office. Nigel Murray, who took over from Craig Climo as CEO in 2014, was earning over $500,000 per annum, but also had expenses of more than $200,000 over 3 years. And he spent 6 months of the past financial year travelling. He resigned on October 5th and an Audit New Zealand review into his spending is due for release. But Craig Climo says in his 17 years leading DHBs, he took just one overseas trip. We'll hear from Craig Climo in a moment. It's a fascinating interview, but we won't be hearing from Nigel Murray, the man who felt so little compunction about charging you for fine dining, fine hotels and international travel has simply disappeared without trace, and that seems rather ungrateful. So, on his behalf, using actual expenses from his time as DHB CEO and asking the people of Waikato for their opinion of them, Bridget Burke has prepared this thank you message to the nation from Nigel Murray. We're sure this is what he'd like to say.
September 6, 2016, I lost my Auckland International Airport parking ticket. You paid the $74 fee to get me out of the car park. Thank you. Flight to San Francisco to visit HealthTap. Check. Accommodation at the Nobu Hotel Epiphany Palo Alto, booked at $799 a night. Check. Chocolate chip cookie, Coke Classic Resonance Water at $20 a bottle, cashews, some peanut M&Ms and some smoky almonds. A meal delivered to my room from Lure and Till restaurant. Dinner at Palo Alto Creamery downtown, $60. Thank you.
Gee, couldn't we all live like that? Shocking.
September 21st, 2016. Another night at the wonderful Nobu Hotel Epiphany, booked at $799. A snack bar from the minibar, 2 room service meals for $114 from Lure and Till, and valet parking for my overnight guest. Thank you.
Absolutely shocking.
September 22nd, 2016, the Western Hotel Palo Alto, $510 for the night for 2 of us in a room, including meals from the Luna Lounge and valet parking. Thank you.
Average person is struggling just to survive.
October 20th, 2016, Harbourside Ocean Bar and Grill. I paid for the 20-year-old Tawny Port and some fries, but you paid for a Montes Pilsner, some Prophet's Rock Riesling, game fish, asparagus, a grilled market fish salad and summer pudding. Thank you. The same day, October 20th, 2016. Only it's technically the next day because I've flown to New York. Dinner at the Palm 2 restaurant. I paid for a Tanqueray gin, an Absolute vodka and a bottle of wine. You paid for a Caesar salad, a 24-ounce ribeye steak which cost $59 alone, and a cheese au gratin. Thank you so much.
I'd like to take my family out for a $59 steak too. I could feed my whole family for 2 nights on that one meal.
October 21st, 2016, Serafina restaurant in New York. I paid for my own draft Peroni, Whispering Angel Rose and an Argula Parmesan salad, but you sheltered me a lunch of alla nucina and 2 coffees. Thank you.
Just think it's gluttony.
For dinner, we went to the Brooklyn Diner. I paid for a draft beer and a glass of Pinot Noir, but you paid for a hot dog and a bowl of chili for $34. Thank you. October 22nd, 2016, Moncton, Canada. You paid $1,193 for a rental car for a month. Thank you.
Bad business.
December 7, 2016. You paid $97 for another lost parking ticket at Auckland International Airport. Thank you. December 20, 2016, Federal Street, Delhi, Auckland. You paid for a meat board and a hot dog. Thank you.
Disgusting. Because people are crying out for operations and they can't have them.
January 26, 2017, the Blueberries Inn on Ponsonby Road. I can't remember, but on recollection it looks like you paid for 2 Galbraith's Pilsners, a mojito and a Pinot Noir. We had 2 pork buns and truffle dumplings. Thank you. February 10, 2017, Bulcott Street Bistro, Wellington for dinner. A bottle of Black Estate wine and 2 glasses of Amersfield Riesling. I paid for that, but you paid for calamari, fish cakes, filet béarnaise, market fish and sides of cauliflower and mushrooms.
I think it's absolutely bloody disgusting.
And we would never have had any privileges like that.
If he's getting paid by the public, he has to be also responsible and accountable for what he does.
And we had sticky date pudding and an eclair for dessert. Thank you.
I think he was just a sharp operator.
Thank you.
Bridget Burke put that thank you together on Nigel Murray's behalf. They were actual expenses. Craig Climo was Nigel Murray's predecessor as the DHB CEO. He hasn't previously spoken about Nigel Murray's behaviour and his departure, and he's awaiting the Audit Office and State Services Commission reports. But he says a CEO should be in the office and not constantly swanning around the world spending money at expensive hotels and restaurants. And he says he simply doesn't understand how that situation was allowed to continue. I asked Craig Climo, first of all, how long he was the DHB CEO for.
7 years, and for the 10 years prior to that, South Canterbury District Health Board and its predecessors.
So 17 years as a CEO of a DHB?
Yes.
And how many times did you go overseas during those 17 years?
Once, to Australia.
Once in 17 years?
But having said that, I'm at the other extreme, and there would be many people who would say that's inadequate. That's too few to be discharging the job properly. I have a different view.
And what was your view? Was your view about the money?
Partly. It was also about modelling, creating expectations. I don't think it's necessary to swan around the planet in order to pick up and adopt other people's ideas. So, as you might have picked up from what I've said already, I am a bit of an outlier in my views.
And you're certainly in your personal fiscal restraint. So, when we compare you as an outlier and Nigel Murray, who I think it is fair to say was an outlier at the other extreme, and he was away roughly half the time in his last year, what do you make of that?
Well, it was an abuse of his position at every level. Firstly, the expenditure, and secondly, the time away. And he needed to be on the ground. For any chief executive, it doesn't matter in what industry, I think the time on the ground is related to the issues the organisation faces. And all DHBs are facing issues. They're large, complex organisations. Waikato District Health Board employs around 6,500 people. They literally have hundreds of providers to them. So my attitude is that's where the time should be spent, not swanning around. And what's even worse is, from what I've read, and bear in mind, John, what I'm talking about with you is based on what's in the public domain.
Absolutely.
I don't have any private information around this. But a good deal of that time and expenditure seem to be about promoting an American IT vendor's product. It's bizarre.
Were you surprised when Nigel Murray got the job?
I was a little. Yes, I was a little. Yeah, I don't want to say much more.
And I don't want to push you, because you played no role whatsoever in the decision.
No.
You were the former CEO. You had gone by then, and you played no part whatsoever in appointing Nigel Murray. But could I ask you, if you don't mind, and you don't have to elaborate on why you were surprised?
Because of Nigel's reputation in New Zealand at what was Southland District Health Board at that time. Spending time over in British Columbia when he was employed at Southland as Chief Executive.
And then he got a job subsequently in British Columbia, didn't he?
He did, and I understand there was a claim that he was working there as an unpaid advisor or some such thing, but it struck myself at the time, and certainly other colleagues, as being unusual.
I've been speaking to clinicians at the Waikato DHB, and they have a very real sense that Nigel Murray was the minister's and the ministry's man there. In other words, that he was committed to bringing the DHB in on budget, that he was committed to not having deficits, that he was committed to doing whatever was required to achieve financial targets. Did you hear those sorts of descriptions of him?
No, and as you can imagine, I wasn't part of the recruitment process. But this is the first time that I've heard any suggestion that he was the minister and minister's man. Now, having said that, he was certainly the chairman's man, that's for sure.
In what way?
Bob Simcock has tied, I guess, nailed his colours to the Nigel Murray cross. I saw him very much as Bob's appointment, Bob's man. And whilst the board as a whole has to accept responsibility and fairness, the chairman, particularly in these sorts of appointment processes, has a great deal of influence. The board's quite reliant, really, on the chair's advice. And there were issues. Everybody's aware of the concerns that swirled around prior to the appointment. Now, again, I imagine the investigation will look at those.
Craig, did the Waikato DHB have video conference facilities?
Yes, it does.
And were staff encouraged to use those facilities rather than travel?
Yes, they are.
And for obvious reasons, to save money, right? To improve efficiency, to have staff at work on the ground more than they are away, and to spend less.
Correct. And it's efficient. But also it's not just to replace face-to-face meetings amongst management-type people. It's also used clinically as well, and it's invaluable there. It speeds the seeing of patients. It's more convenient for patients as well. So, yeah, there certainly are video conferencing facilities. There's quite a number of them.
So once again, this brings us back to the remarkable number of days Nigel Murray was travelling.
It's gobsmacking. It really is. And out of all of this, it's the staff and the management that I feel incredibly sorry for. And providers to that organisation. And as you're aware, it's a district health board, like many, that's struggling to make ends meet. And imagine how difficult it is for the management to be out there selling to the staff and providers that they have to tighten their belts yet again. It's just bizarre. As I said at the outset, at every level, the money, the time, the incredibly poor example that it sets. But I'm just like to add, if I may, that I'm very proud of the team for raising the issues, for pursuing it. Good on them. Good on them for doing that.
You talk of your pride in the whistleblowing, effectively, by people who were below Nigel Murray in the organisation and therefore were doing so at some risk to themselves.
Correct.
What about the governance from the board? Was there enough oversight being kept on a man who had arrived with warnings against him and with assurances given that he would be watched?
Well, it appears not. I have no idea how somebody could spend half their work time absent and spend all that money without it being obvious. All expenses should be signed off, if not in advance, at least retrospectively for the more minor items. But I wouldn't expect to travel as a chief executive internationally without that being signed off in advance. Whenever I was away, and I would imagine most chief executives would work like this, even as a matter of courtesy, I would inform the chairman that I'm going to be away. And he'd been away so often, you imagine the chairman, just in the normal course of events, would have phoned or emailed or gone in to have a conversation with him and found him not there. But I don't know. As I said, I just do not know how this could have arisen.
That's Craig Clamo, Nigel Murray's predecessor at the Waikato DHB. 26 minutes to 6 here with the headlines is Katrina Batten.
The Supreme Court has ruled that WorkSafe's decision not to prosecute the Pike River mine boss Peter Whittle over the deaths of 29 men was unlawful. However, the length of time that has passed since the 2010 explosion means he will not face further court action. WorkSafe initially laid 12 health and safety charges against Mr Whittle, but they were dropped after more than $3 million was paid to the victims' families. The minister responsible for Pike River re-entry, Andrew Little, says while the families have been vindicated by the court's decision, those responsible have got away scot-free. A WorkSafe investigator is describing flagrant health and safety breaches by a company in South Auckland as on a par with Pike River. In 2015, 24-year-old Jamie Lee Bowring was killed when he was thrown more than 100 metres after a tank he was working on exploded at Salter's Cartage in Wiri. The company director, Ron Salter, was today sentenced to 4.5 months home detention. He and his company were fined more than $400,000. Auckland councillors have chosen a compromise option for creating an America's Cup village, opting to spread bases over 3 wharves, each needing small extensions. The $132 million option is for 8 bases built across the Wynyard, Halsey Street and Hobson wharves. A senior police officer acquitted on charges of kidnapping a teenager says he was trying to help the boy and let his passion get the better of him. People in the public gallery applauded when Inspector Huri Moana Dennis and a fellow officer, Sergeant Vaughan Perry, were found not guilty in the High Court in Auckland. The entire town of Taupō remains without power. 16,000 properties were cut off during routine maintenance on a substation 4 hours ago. Unison says electricity should be restored early this evening. And the central Otago town of Cromwell has hit its hottest spring temperature on record today, 33.3 degrees. That's a degree higher than the previous record set in 2010. Those are the headlines. I'm back at 6.
Thanks, Katrina. We'll go to Cromwell shortly, but let's go to Nona first. Nona Peltier with business news. The country's biggest retirement village operator, Nona, Ryman Healthcare, first half profit boosted by increased margins on the sale of old units. What's that mean?
Well, look, there's a lot of people queuing up to move into retirement villages, aging population. It's what you'd expect with people looking, they don't really want to retire to a village. They need to retire to a village. So there's pent-up demand. So Ryman is selling those units, as many as they can get onto the market at a better price than they got before. And of course, the company, which is the largest retirement village operator, is making quite a lot on that turnover. And so good for the company. And so their net profit rose 8.4% to $202.6 million in the first 6 months.
Holy moly, that's a healthy old profit.
Their underlying profit was 85.2, which is sort of shows the kind of way the company is going. And they're forecasting a very strong second half, which will give them a big lift for the rest of the financial year. And that was reflected in their share price, which rose nearly 3%, 24 cents to $9.45.
Retail spending slowed to the slowest rate of more than 2 years in the September quarter.
Right.
What's going on there?
Well, it's a wet winter. We've heard that before with people saying that wet winter made things a bit sluggish. And also the house market, a little uncertainty there. And the lack of major events. So we've had, so that was in comparison to previous times. So just to give you some contrast there, retail spending rose a seasonally adjusted 0.2% in the quarter ending September. The quarter before was 1.8%, so that's a big difference.
Yeah, it is.
And economists are saying, well, that's probably going to be reflected on our economic growth because retail spending, consumer spending, makes up about 2/3 of our economic profile overall. So yeah, we can expect to see that happening. And actually, those companies that are exposed to retail, the Warehouse, Kathmandu, Cavalier, Trilogy, Moa, and even Briscoe Group were affected by that, with the Warehouse share price falling 4%. The NZX Top 50 Index fell 3 points overall. That was partly boosted by Ryman to 8,102. And you might wonder what the dollar was doing.
I was just wondering that.
Yeah, yes. It's trading at 68.8 US cents, 90.3 Australian and 51.6 pence.
Nona Peltier, thank you very much indeed, Nona. It was the centre of controversy during the election campaign, Labor's tax plans. Now the government's revealed both the mandate of its tax working group and the man at its helm, former Finance Minister and Labour Party stalwart, of course, Michael Cullen. Here is our political reporter, Craig McCulloch.
At last, the big reveal. The man who'll lead Labour's crack squad tasked with overhauling the tax system. Drum roll, please.
Sir Michael Cullen will be the chair of the tax working group.
Sir Michael's a former finance minister and deputy prime minister in the Clark government. He was also part of Labour's negotiating team to form this government. And the current finance minister, Grant Robertson, says he's the perfect fit for the new role.
Sir Michael is widely respected across the political spectrum and has been used by governments of both Labour and National for his expertise.
The other 7 members of the group, a mix of tax experts, businesses and workers, are still top secret, although their names are expected to be revealed in the next few weeks. They've been directed to look at New Zealand's whole tax system, focusing on measures to cool the housing market, look after the environment and boost business.
We are not setting out on this process to increase or grab revenue. We're setting out on this process to get a fairer and more balanced tax system.
So here's what's not on the table. The group won't look at putting up income tax or GST. It won't consider an inheritance tax or a water tax, and nothing that will affect the family home. Apart from that, Sir Michael's open to whatever comes up.
Some people assume that there's a decision already made, and all this is about is simply justifying a decision. Well, there's absolutely no truth in that.
And that is exactly National's attack line.
What Labor wants is a capital gains tax.
Stephen Joyce is ridiculing the idea the group's independent, given its chair is a Labour stalwart.
It'd be like the National Party inviting John Key to be an independent chair of something. It just doesn't work.
The tax expert Norman Gemmell is waiting to cast his judgment till he sees the full lineup. The university professor and former Treasury chief economist sat on the last tax working group in 2009. His main concern is that the scope could be too narrow.
It would be slightly odd to say, well, we're not even going to consider changing income tax rates. And that sounds to me more like a political choice than a carefully designed choice from the point of view of assessing the tax system.
Glenn Barclay from the Public Service Association has the same worry. He wishes both income and inheritance tax were being considered.
If you're going to tackle issues like unfairness in the tax system, inequality, then you need to broaden the dialogue, I think.
The group will report back on its findings in September next year, with a final report due in February 2019. No significant changes will come into effect until after the 2020 election. Atu iti whare paremata mō te hotaka o te ahiahi ko Craig McCulloch.
This was a story that broke on Checkpoint last night. The government wants to be able to punish charities who refuse to follow the rules. 2 of Destiny Church's biggest charities will be deregistered next month after ignoring multiple extensions and warnings. The Charities Register Board went as far as saying the removal is in the public interest, but they're unlikely to be punished in any way. The government wants that to change, and perhaps change soon. It's made a review of the Charities Act one of its priorities. It will be underway within its first 100 days. Zach Fleming, who broke the story last night, has more.
Yes, we will be reviewing the Charities Act.
That is fantastic news.
Well done, Minister.
Charities experts welcoming that news after the national government took them on a review roller coaster, promising one, then going back on it.
I do expect that the review will be started, so the terms of reference done, the scope done, within our 100-day plan.
Meaning, Minister for the Community and Voluntary Sector, Pini Henare, has made it a priority. Among his key concerns,
the nature of advocacy by charities and how tax advantages are distributed through the system.
And he wants to introduce punishments for non-compliance, for situations like Destiny Church. 2 of the church's biggest charities are being deregistered after failing to file their financial returns for 2 years. They ignored multiple extensions and warnings from the Charities Registration Board. But they can't be penalised, even though the board said it's in the public interest to deregister them.
Actually making sure that the regulatory board actually has some teeth in that respect, to make sure that that those who aren't compliant actually suffer some form of penalty or consequence, and it's got to be more than simply deregistration.
The board went as far as saying the integrity of the charities register would not be maintained if they remained charities.
If it's good enough for the small charity that runs on the smell of an oily rag to be compliant, then it must be consistent across the board.
And the doozy, how do we define charitable purpose? Or in other words, what's allowed to be a charity and what isn't? Currently, New Zealand and many other countries work off England's Statute of Charitable Uses, which is 416 years old.
The legislation is supported by 400 years of case law, and I don't have the time to read through 400 years of case law, but that's always been in one of the issues around exactly what is a charitable purpose. And I think just by the mere fact that there are so many charities out there,
27,477.
perhaps one of the findings of the review could be that, well, we do need to tidy that particular register up.
But it could instead be the rules are relaxed.
We have the right number of charities for our population as determined by the people that want to form them, if you know what I mean.
Charities collectively pull in nearly $20 billion worth of income each year. Most of that's from donations. Charities law expert Sue Barker says the sector's leash should be loosened. The first page of Labour and New Zealand First's coalition agreement says they'll provide a transformational government, committed to a healthy environment, a fair society and a reduction of inequality and poverty.
The charitable sector can help them with that, and if we can get a framework of charity regulation that helps them rather than stops them, then it's in absolutely everyone's interest. It's so important. I think it's a great thing.
Charities expert Michael Guzme agrees.
I think the point is to support and assist charities, particularly the smaller ones.
But he wants that nearly $20 billion income figure looked at.
The wealth that many charities are sitting on, and how is that wealth being applied to charitable purposes as against being put in the bank for a rainy day.
Charities like Sanitarium, which is run by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The church has $368 million worth of assets, including $79 million in cash. Minister Henare wants the review over and done with by August, but admits that's unlikely.
I'm ambitious if I say I'd love to see it done within 8 months, but I'm sure I'll get some advice from the officials about that, about a suitable time frame.
The government's 100th day, when the review will be started by, is February 3rd. For Checkpoint, Zach Fleming.
Destiny Church founders Hannah and Brian Tamaki declined to be interviewed today again, but in a statement they called the Charities Board incompetent, demanded an apology and say they will appeal the deregistrations. A long-time WorkSafe investigator has compared the health and safety breaches by a company in South Auckland to those at Pike River. 24-year-old Jamie Lee Bowring was killed in 2015 when he was thrown from a tank which exploded at Salter's Cartage in Wiri. Company director Ron Salter was fined and today sentenced to 4.5 months home detention. Looking at this, here's Bridget Mills.
The health and safety failures surrounding the death of Jamie Lee Bowring were described as flagrant, while the boss of the company, Ron Salter, was told his level of culpability was in the extremely high range. Mr Bowring had been asked to do some welding, grinding and sanding work on some newly installed handrails on a tank. Judge Richard McElwraith described what happened next on that day in September 2015.
CCTV imagery at the time shows Mr Bowring doing hot work on tank 20 with visible sparks around him. At approximately 1:36 p.m. there was an explosion in tank 20 while Mr Bowring was working on top of it. The force of the explosion propelled him some distance to a neighbouring car yard. He was killed as a result of multiple blunt force trauma. The explosion also propelled the 450 kilogram lid of tank 20 some 100 metres and displaced the tank itself 420 millimetres from its original foundation and caused it to change shape to become elliptical. Debris was propelled over a wide area of up to 200 metres.
Jamie Lee Bowring's mother, Sarah Ferguson, described her firstborn son to reporters outside court.
He was cheeky, beautiful, lit up a room. He was my world.
She's had to attend court numerous times since his death and is pleased this will be her last.
We're really grateful that this process is over and the truth has prevailed. We're very thankful for all the people that worked very hard on this case, but nothing can bring our boy home.
WorkSafe investigated the case and brought a raft of charges against Ron Salter, Salter's Cartage and the contractor who employed Mr Bowring, Raceworks Limited. Keith Stewart was the lead investigator. He's been at WorkSafe and its previous iterations for almost 3 decades. He says this is one of the most serious cases he's seen, putting it in the same ballpark as the Pike River explosion in terms of the serious potential for danger.
The consequences of what could have happened in Manukau is horrendous. As what I heard in court, the large parts of the tank were blown into the Manukau area, and we could have been looking at numerous fatalities.
The core activity of Salter's cartage is the processing of used oil into burner fuel for furnaces. Judge Richard McElwraith says there were no safety arrangements in place. Tank 20, where Jamie Lee Bowring was working, turned out to have a 2,000 to 3,000 litre mix of diesel, petrol, kerosene and oil.
The tank was not certified as being designed, constructed and stored, operated, maintained, inspected, tested and repaired so that it would be compliant for the hazardous substances it contained. Tank 20 had deficient venting, which meant it could not have been verified as safe for the flammable liquid and vapour it contained.
Judge Richard McElwraith ordered Salter to pay Mr Bowring's family $110,000 in reparation. Among the other fines was one for $56,000 for breaching a prohibition notice that was set in place after the death.
It is hard to imagine a more flagrant breach of prohibition notice than has occurred in this case. That it occurred in the context of a fatal accident is what lifts the assessment of culpability of this offending beyond that identified in any other case referred to me.
Judge Richard McElwraith says there was an apparent willingness to put profit ahead of safety. Ron Salter himself spoke just briefly to reporters after his sentencing.
It's been a difficult time for everyone. We accept the court's decision and I hope that everyone can move on. Thank you very much.
His 4.5 months of home detention will begin today. Mo te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Bridget Mills.
Police Inspector Huri Moana Dennis says 2 years of stress and worry lifted from his shoulder after he was found not guilty of kidnapping a teenager in a bid to break up his love affair with an underage girl. The Te Puia Marae Chair and Sergeant Vaughan Perry were on trial over the mock arrest of a 17-year-old who says they locked him in a police cell and made a move to Australia to end his relationship with a 15-year-old. Today they were cleared of all charges at the High Court in Auckland. Sally Murphy was there.
On charge 1, the charge of kidnapping, do you find the defendant Huri Moana Nui Dennis guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
On the same charge,
after 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with 3 unanimous not guilty verdicts.
Mr Dennis, Mr Perry, you've both been found not guilty of the charges against you. You may stand down out of the dock. You are free to go.
Inspector Huri Moana Dennis and his co-worker Vaughan Perry were teary-eyed in the dock. They turned to each other and hongied. The chair of the Te Puia Marae faced 2 charges of kidnapping and Mr Perry 1, with the Crown's case that they unlawfully detained a 17-year-old without his consent. Mr Dennis says he showed the boy around the cells to demonstrate where he could end up if his relationship continued. He says the boy was clear it was a visit. He was doing so at the request of the teenager's family, who were concerned about his relationship. Outside court today, Huri Moana Dennis thanked his lawyer, Stephen Bonar, the Police Association and his family, who he says have endured 2 years of stress and embarrassment.
My actions or my involvement with this investigation and this issue can best be described as practical common sense, big picture policing with a bit of heart and a good blend of LAW and LORE. And really I'm just saying that is my job.
Mr Dennis says the only thing he and Mr Perry did wrong was be proud Māori officers. He wished the young couple involved well in their futures.
There was so much more going on in this family and in the young people's lives that scared the heck out of me. I would also like to say that there are some family members who should have come forward to tell the truth, and they did not. What I would like to say to them is, you need to go and find your conscience, because when you find your conscience, you'll find your values, your morals and your tikanga.
Mr Dennis says the 17-year-old's family were just trying to protect him.
That's why I got out of bed, to help a very, very good family who all they wanted to do was to protect their moko and their tamaiti and these 2 kids, nothing more, nothing less. In actual fact, this was the young man's point of difference. He actually had a family that cared. A lot of our Māori men who come into the judicial system skate on their own.
In a statement, the police reiterated the court was the right place for the matter to be determined. They say they are not in a position to comment on the verdicts due to an employment investigation. At the High Court in Auckland for Checkpoint, Sally Murphy.
It was the verdict thousands of people had waited almost a quarter of a century for. The former Bosnian Serb military leader Ratko Mladic had been found guilty of genocide and other crimes against humanity. The former general, dubbed the Butcher of Bosnia, was found guilty of 10 of the 11 charges brought against him by a UN War Crimes Tribunal, mostly relating to the 1995 Srebrenica massacre and the 4-year siege of the capital, Sarajevo. The ABC's Europe correspondent was in Srebrenica as people watched the verdict.
With respect to the Srebrenica joint criminal.
In a small room at the Potocari Memorial for the 8,000 victims of the genocide, the mothers of Srebrenica gathered to watch the verdict on television. They prayed, they wept, they nervously rocked back and forth as they waited for the judgment. These women had lost their sons and husbands at the hands of the Bosnian Serb death squads. When they heard the verdict, the room erupted with emotion. The former general was found guilty of 10 of 11 charges of war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide.
For having committed these crimes, the chamber sentences Mr. Ratko Mladic to life imprisonment.
Mladic was not in court for the verdict. He was thrown out after showing contempt for the proceedings.
Mr. Mladic, if you continued like this, we curtains down. Mr. Mladic will be removed from the courtroom. That's how healthy he is.
The verdict was a relief for Saliha Osmanovic. Her whole family was wiped out by Mladic's forces. She now lives alone in a small village outside Srebrenica. All those things he did, she said. Finally a day came, a second, a minute came that confirmed that it had happened. He was hiding for years. He could not remain hidden. A number of Serb political leaders, including the mayor of Srebrenica, continued to deny that genocide took place and claimed that the man dubbed the Butcher of Bosnia is actually a war hero, not a war criminal. Mladic's son Darko railed against the verdict.
This is great injustice done to Serbian people in the first place. And my father was the symbol of this fight for the freedom of Serbian people.
That's Mladic's son Darko ending that report from the ABC. Let's head now to Central Otago and Cromwell. And there is not much more than I can say to introduce the story other than it was 33 degrees there today. Maya Burry tells us more.
Fourth-generation Cromwell fruit grower Simon Webb says in the 40 years he has lived in the central Otago town, he has never experienced weather this hot in November.
It's just blue skies and calm, and you can feel the burn in the sun. It's really, really hot. I took the kids down to the lake last night for a swim, and they really enjoyed it, and there are plenty of other families and staff and things down there as well. So, yep, it's a pleasant place to be at right now.
Mr Webb's family business, Webb's Fruit, is one of many orchards based in central Otago. He says the recent heat has meant the fruit had grown faster than usual, and they will now have to start picking it from the trees earlier.
It's good and bad, because we won't get the supply of fruit as late into the season. By the time we get to March, the supply of stone fruit could run out this year, but it also means there's going to be plenty of fruit around that Christmas period.
NIWA meteorologist Ben Knoll says inland parts of Otago, Southland and Canterbury have been unseasonably warm recently. Today there was a forecast of 29 degrees in Wanaka and Alexandra, while Queenstown was expected to reach 26 degrees. Mr Knoll says the early start to the summer season has been driven by a La Niña weather event, which tends to make the South Island warm and dry.
Records are records for a reason. So when you are breaking them, you are in some pretty rare territory. So it is unusual, but not necessarily unprecedented in terms of the weather pattern that we are seeing.
Ben Knoll says in Canterbury, Christchurch and Lincoln are both on track to have the driest November on record, with so far only 1 millimetre of rain in Christchurch and 0.4 millimetres in Lincoln. Mr Knoll says it was also looking dry in Timaru, where there has been 8 millimetres of rain this month.
So not just the heat, but it is the dryness that we've seen unfolding. So That's going to play a role in the agricultural sector. The irrigation season may start early, and that, play a role in how things unfold for the remainder of summer.
A Canterbury Regional Councillor and farmer, Tom Lambie, says he started irrigating his dairy farm in Pleasant Point again in the last few days. He says if the dry weather continues, it's likely some water restrictions for farmers in Canterbury will be required over the summer.
We've had an amazing recharge in the groundwater over the autumn, winter and spring. But just the way the weather has gone at the moment, we've gone into a reasonably extended period of no rainfall, and then that's very quickly starting to impact on the need to irrigate and, I guess, on the flows in the rivers.
Ben Knowles says the theme overall going into December and January is above average temperatures across the country. He says some rainfall in the North Island is expected, but the South Island will have to continue to watch for dryness. For Checkpoint, Maya Burry.
Katrina came in when that story was on and she said, cherries.
Central cherries.
Ooh.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui, good evening. Ko Katrina Batten aho. The widow of a miner killed in the Pike River mine explosion says a Supreme Court decision ruling against WorkSafe is a monumental victory. The court has found the agency's decision to drop charges against the mine boss, Peter Whittle, after the victims' families were paid more than $3 million was unlawful. Anna Osborne, who took the case against WorkSafe, along with Sonia Rockhouse, told Checkpoint the ruling shows justice should not be bought.
There's 29 men who went to work that day and were killed, and not one person had been held to account. And then WorkSafe thought it was safe and okay to do a backroom deal and put money in the family's bank accounts so that all charges were dropped against Peter Whittle. How unlawful is that?
Anna Osborne, whose husband Milton died in the blast 7 years ago, says she hopes the case will set a precedent. WorkSafe says it accepts the Supreme Court ruling. Its chief executive, Nicole Rosie, says it clarifies the approach the regulator should have taken and will take in the future in such circumstances. She says she hopes the decision will bring some relief to the families, and the agency will be seeking a meeting with them shortly to discuss it. Ms Rosie says as a result of the family's commitment, New Zealand is a safer place to work, with new health and safety legislation and a regulatory unit focused on hazardous jobs. A senior police officer acquitted on charges of kidnapping a teenager says he was trying to help the boy and let his passion get the better of him. People in the public gallery applauded when Inspector Hurimoana Dennis and a fellow officer, Sergeant Vaughan Perry, were found not guilty in the High Court in Auckland this afternoon. Sally Murphy was there.
Charges were brought against the two men after the then 17-year-old said they searched him, locked him in a cell and told him that if he didn't move to Australia and forget about his underage girlfriend, he would be charged with statutory rape. Mr Dennis and Mr Perry embraced and hongied in the dock when the jury's verdict was read out. Speaking outside afterwards, Hurimoana Dennis said he was helping the boy's family, who simply wanted to protect him. He said all his actions within the case were common sense, and the only thing he and Mr Perry did wrong was to be proud Māori officers. The police reiterated the court was the right place for the case to be determined, but would not comment further because of an ongoing employment investigation. At the High Court in Auckland, Sally Murphy.
The whole of Taupo has been without power this afternoon. 16,000 properties are affected, with only a few homes on the rural fringe unaffected. A spokesperson for Unison says a fault occurred at the Transpower station at Wairake during maintenance. McDonald's owner Des Burns says when they realised how serious the outage was, they locked down all the fridges and freezers and shut up shop. He says there would be no major damage as long as Transpower gets the power back on by this evening as predicted.
No doubt those poor buggers are working their buns off to get us back on, but it's not much you can do really unless you got a generator.
Taupo McDonald's owner Des Burns. Auckland councillors have chosen a compromise option for creating an America's Cup village, opting to spread bases over 3 wharves, each needing small extensions. After a 3-hour meeting, councillors chose the $132 million option to build 8 bases across the Wynyard, Halsey Street and Hobson wharves. Team New Zealand had preferred a bigger and more expensive extension of Halsey Street wharf, stretching 220 metres into the inner harbour. The team's chair, Sir Stephen Tindall, told today's meeting they could work with the option to spread the bases more widely. The chosen option had been recommended by council officers and backed early in the piece by the Mayor Phil Goff. Mr Goff and the council's chief executive will now negotiate detailed arrangements with the government and Team New Zealand before seeking final sign-off from councillors in mid-December. Planning consent will be sought next year, and the 3 sites will take 10 months to build. And Auckland councillors have been given the go-ahead for new moorings for cruise ships extending 85 metres out into the Waitemata Harbour. The decision ends a year-long delay after Mr Goff halted a similar plan, worried about its cost and intrusion into the harbour beyond Queen's Wharf. Technical reports since have concluded the addition of 2 mooring platforms linked by a walkway is the only way to accommodate increased visits by larger liners. Mr Goff backs the new plan, saying without the platforms, Auckland will not be able to host a new generation of larger ships. And that would mean the loss of hundreds of millions of dollars and 1,000 new jobs.
I wasn't prepared to look kids in the eye that are currently not in employment, education and training and say, well, as a middle class person with a good job, I'm prepared to wave away the opportunities that the growth in the cruise industry will create for you.
Phil Goff. Councillors approved the proposal 15-5. The public will be able to have a say at resource consent hearings. The Education Ministry is blaming human error for paying nearly every school the wrong amount in the first run of a funding system that could lead to a replacement for schools' decile funding. 2,200 schools received too little or too much money from the grant, which is based on data matching with the Ministry of Social Development. Our education correspondent John Gerritsen reports.
The targeted at-risk funding allocated $12 million to schools with children whose parents have been on a benefit for a significant period of their lives. The ministry says out of 2,430 state and integrated schools, 800 were underpaid a total of $560,000 and 1,400 were overpaid $1.3 million. It says it will give the underpaid schools a top-up next year and the overpaid schools will keep the money. Ko John Gerritsen tēnei.
It's 6:06. The sport and England are making small gains late on day 1 of the first Ashes test against Australia in Brisbane. Opener Alistair Cook fell cheaply on 2. Mark Stoneham and James Vince have combined for an 80-run partnership. Rain delayed the start of play after lunch, but players have since returned to the field. A short time ago, England were 92-1 as they near the end of the opening day. New Zealand Football Chief Executive Andy Martin says he hasn't given any consideration to who will replace the outgoing All Whites coach Anthony Hudson. Hudson has stepped down from the role following last week's failed World Cup qualifying bid against Peru. Martin wouldn't speculate on whether he'll source a new coach internationally or from within New Zealand, but says there's already been interest in the position. The Crusaders believe the hiring of former Ireland international Ronan O'Gara will not only benefit them, but all of New Zealand rugby. O'Gara will be the backs coach for the Super Rugby champions next year. Crusaders CEO Hamish Riak says the movement of coaches around the world helps the game evolve.
He's played and coached in the Northern Hemisphere. He has his own personality and his own style and the way he sees that the game should continue to evolve, and then you put that in the melting pot with Razor and Brad and Jace, and then you mix that with the leaders on the field, and you end up with an approach to 2018 for the Crusaders that's hopefully successful.
Hamish Riak. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, this week's cultural ambassador Kirsten Zemke pulls no punches with a look at how hip-hop has tackled the issue of youth depression and suicide. William Dart's New Horizons is at the crossroads where soul meets Captain Beefheart. And our changing world charts New Zealand's entry into the space race.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, liftoff.
On Nights with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow, Northland to Waitomo, Coromandel Peninsula, Bay of Plenty, Taupo, Taumaranui and Taihape. Also the ranges of Gisborne. Mostly fine, isolated afternoon and evening showers, mainly inland. For the remainder of Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, also Taranaki to Wellington and Wairarapa. Fine apart from some areas of cloud morning and night. For all of the South Island, fine, apart from areas of cloud or fog morning and night, but cloudy areas lingering about coastal Canterbury and Otago tomorrow afternoon and evening. Also isolated afternoon and evening showers inland, spreading to coastal Canterbury and Otago tomorrow evening. And the Chatham Islands, cloudy with occasional drizzle. It's 6:09 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina Batten. We return now to our lead story tonight, the Supreme Court's judgment that WorkSafe's decision to not prosecute Peter Whittle over the deaths of 29 men in the Pike River mine explosion 7 years ago on last Sunday, was unlawful. The decision to not prosecute was made after Peter Whittle agreed to pay $3.5 million to the Pike River families. That word, unlawful, is not only a striking victory for Anna Osborne and Sonia Rockhouse, who took the case, but also for Nigel Hampton, QC. Now, we spoke to both Nigel Hampton and Anna Osborne earlier in the program, and that interview is on our website if you didn't hear it. Lots of reaction to it, thank you. But we're going back to the lawyer who took the case to the Supreme Court and won. Nigel Hampton says this was something that mattered not only to the Pike families, but to us all.
There's a principle involved, John. I mean, never ever in my, I've been practicing law for 50-something years, and I've never in my education in the law, let alone in my practice of the law, ever thought that I would see the day when in exchange for money, a prosecution was put an end to, and it smelled in my nostrils when I first sniffed it, and it still does, and it always would. And I mean, to have a clear declaration that this is the principle and that we are still guided by principles in our system, it is a principled system. To allow this to happen would lead to corruption and an unprincipled system. It's as simple as that.
I was in the High Court in Christchurch that day. The decision not to prosecute on the basis of the WorkSafe payments was announced, on the basis of the payments was announced. And no one even really understood it. I don't think the families understood what they were being told.
No, I think that's probably right. They were never consulted, and they were presented with a fait accompli, and it was a stinking mess of excrement.
So where to now?
Where to now? I don't know. Well, it's the end of this part of it. I mean, the two women wanted to feel vindicated that they thought that this was wrong, and they were right in thinking that. And they want a public statement as unequivocal as you can get, and we've got it now, that this was wrong and that this shouldn't have happened, and that WorkSafe had to carry on with the prosecution or make a decision that they didn't have a case based on evidential factors, not on payment of money.
Peter Whittle is now living in New South Wales. Do you think, and I know now we are getting really into the realm of hypothesis and speculation, and that's never been your department, but do you think there is now a possibility that he will be prosecuted?
No, we didn't. In the end, the time has gone so far by now. Realistically, there's no prospect of picking up that prosecution now and doing it. The two women can't take a private prosecution because that's long out of time in terms of the legislation. And WorkSafe simply won't be, they wouldn't be interested. And to be realistic, and we talked about this with the women before we took the steps that we did take. Realistically, the best result we could get is the very declaration that we've got now.
And so it was a point of principle, and also it was a line in the sand.
Yeah, well, it's a point of principle, and it's a point of principle that not only affects them, the two women, but it's an important point of principle for all New Zealand that we can, from the highest court, say that we do have a principled system of justice, that payment of money doesn't end court cases, criminal court cases, and nor it should. And if you're going to have a principled system of criminal justice, money can't enter into it. It's the old Commonwealth stifling a prosecution, and it's nice to know that our courts will now say stifling can't occur. Because, this had the potential of this was quite large. Imagine busy district courts up and down the country where they're presented with, and it's an example I used in the course of argument in the Supreme Court. Say someone's been in a serious motor crash and and the crash has caused death or serious injury, and they're charged with careless use causing death. They deny the charge. The police case isn't the best in the world. They keep on denying the charge, but say, look, I've got about $35,000 or $40,000 here or something, and if I pay it to the families, and that'll ease, it'll pay for the funeral expenses, and it'll be some sort of solatium towards their grief and so on. And if I do that and they accept that, will you drop the prosecution? How are police prosecutors, if that's allowed to be introduced as this Whittle case would allow it, what effect is that going to have on prosecutions up and down the country? People are going to be buying off prosecutions all the time.
Nigel Hampton, QC, who took the case to the Supreme Court for those reasons and the reason of that he discussed earlier with Anna Osborne after Helen Kelly approached him. That interview is online. I was speaking to him earlier, in fact, just after the Supreme Court made its judgment public. The Minister responsible for Pike River re-entry, Andrew Little, says while the families of the miners have been vindicated by today's Supreme Court decision, those responsible have got away scot-free. Mr Little told our political reporter Benedict Collins that Anna Osborne and Sonia Rockhouse fought their way through the court system and have been enormously vindicated by the ruling. But he says it's unlikely, as Nigel Hampton said, further prosecutions will take place, and there's been a real lack of justice.
Look, I think this is a huge vindication for the families. I think many of us, irrespective of the hats we wear now, looked at what happened 3 or 4 years ago and frankly were stunned. But the Supreme Court has now ruled on it. I think that's the right thing to do. The reality is practically what it means. No further prosecutions can take place. So it really means that the whole re-entry project now is going to be the next best form of justice that the families can get.
Why can no further prosecutions take place?
Under the health and safety legislation, they are time barred. You have to do it within a period of time after the events giving rise to the prosecution. Whether there are other grounds for prosecution under other legislation, including the Crimes Act, it seems pretty remote that anything further could happen. But I think the re-entry project at least gives us the opportunity to get in there, gather any other evidence, including forensic evidence that might be useful, and engage it at that time.
Looks like Peter Whittle's got away with being prosecuted here, hasn't he?
Look, I think everybody will feel a real sense of disappointment that in one of the biggest workplace tragedies, something that the Royal Commission of Inquiry into it said was avoidable, anybody involved was kind of walked away scot-free. I think that is disappointing. That means there is a lack of justice, and we kind of have to make up for it in other ways, and I think the re-entry project is the next best thing.
What should be the consequences for WorkSafe?
In fairness, of course, WorkSafe didn't exist at the time that the prosecution was taken, so it's a new entity and new people. So I think they will learn a lot from this. I think it does both for WorkSafe, for any government agency mounting prosecutions. I think there is a very clear standard now set that the Supreme Court has said that in the face of prosecution decisions, and if big money is being waved around to try and prevent those prosecutions, that's not acceptable. Justice must run its course.
Andrew Little talking to Benedict Collins. Papua New Guinea police, soldiers and government officials moved into Australia's abandoned Manus Island detention centre earlier today. About 400 men have been refusing to leave the facility since it closed at the end of October. Power and water were turned off and conditions have been deteriorating rapidly. The men are refusing to move to new facilities on the island, saying they fear for their safety and don't want to be resettled in PNG or another developing nation permanently. Today they say police moved in, threatening them and destroying their shelters and possessions. The ABC's Sarah White has this report.
As PNG police began moving through the Manus Island detention centre today, the men inside began to chant. A video was quickly uploaded to the Manus Alert social media account, and the ABC began receiving voice memos from one of the refugees inside the centre, Shaminder, describing what he was seeing.
Throwing all of the food and water, and they went inside our room and destroyed everything, and we cannot go inside. They are chasing us with wood, stick and iron bars, and it's getting intense now.
13 minutes after that message, came another voice memo from Shaminda.
The police commander said this is a friendly mission. So what's happening now is that friendly mission. We've been beaten up, we've been bullied, and our belongings all destroyed now. Even food and water.
Sudanese refugee Abdul Aziz Adam has also filmed a speech delivered by an unidentified PNG official.
That this place where you are living now is no longer legal center for the refugees and non-refugees to reside.
But despite the warnings, the refugees and asylum seekers who remain at the centre still aren't leaving. And they're pleading for the United Nations to help. The Manus Island Detention Centre has been officially closed for more than 3 weeks. Some of the detainees have moved into new facilities nearby, but almost 400 men have remained, with little access to food, water or medical care, saying they wouldn't be safe in the Manus community. Immigration Minister Peter Dutton spoke to Sydney radio station 2GB shortly after the PNG authorities moved in.
Obviously, we're very keen for people to move out of the Manus Regional Processing Centre. I think it's outrageous that people are still there and they have trashed the facility. They're living in squalor.
He says no matter what happens on Manus Island today, the men will not be coming to Australia.
They think by staying that somehow they're going to exert pressure on us, and some of them believe that if there's violence with the police, that the footage will be broadcast back here and that will twist our arm and will change the policy position. Under no circumstance will these people be coming to Australia.
Mr Dutton has repeated his assurance that alternate accommodation is available to the men. But a representative from the UN's refugee body, who's on Manus Island, says much of the accommodation is still under construction. The UN also insists there are not enough beds for every refugee or asylum seeker. A spokeswoman for the Australian Federal Police has told the ABC there's one liaison officer in Manus Province, but that officer has not been involved in today's actions.
Sarah White with that report, and the Kurdish journalist Behruz Buchani, who has really kept the world up to date via Twitter on what is happening at Manus, was one of those arrested during today's events. Human error caused nearly every school in the country to get the wrong amount of, in the first run of a new system targeting money to at-risk children. The Education Ministry allocation of $12 million resulted in underpayments of more than $500,000 and overpayments of $1.3 million to about 2,200 schools. The payments were the first under a system developed by the previous government to replace funding based on socio-economic deciles. Our education correspondent John Gerritsen filed this report.
Michelle Whiting at Corinna School only recently learned that her Porirua school got less money than it was entitled to from the new Targeted At-Risk grant this year.
Just last Monday, I received an email confirming that we were going to get an additional $1,000 deposited into our school account in January because we were underfunded by that amount in 2017 for the Targeted At-Risk funding entitlement.
The Education Ministry says the human error happened in data matching with the Ministry of Social Development that showed how many children at each school have parents who have been on a benefit for a long time. Michelle Whiting says her school should have got funding for more of its students.
We are supposed to be funded for 86. That's the entitlement for 2018. And they estimated that we were underfunded in 2017. By 11, we were only funded for 75.
There are 2,430 state and integrated schools, and the ministry says about 800 were underpaid by up to $5,000 and will get a top-up next year. 1,400 other schools were overpaid by up to $10,000. They'll get to keep the money. Among them is South Wellington Intermediate, which got about $400 too much. The principal, Tracy Liddall, says while that doesn't sound like much, the school will miss the money next year.
Every penny matters for a school. $300 or $400 is another Chromebook that could make all the difference to a kid who struggles with reading and writing.
Tracy Liddall says people make mistakes, but she worries schools won't be able to spot errors if the new government adopts the system.
We don't know if they're getting it wrong because we don't know what the formula is and we don't know who those kids are that make up the number. If we knew that, we could be a watchdog as well. Because in my experience in my school, we've had 3 funding errors in 3 years. People make mistakes, but we can't judge that because we're not given the information.
But Mike Williams from the Secondary Principals Association says the error is just a teething problem.
A mistake's not great, but in the big picture, it was a new attempt at a whole new way of bringing funding into schools, the precursor to hopefully what will replace the decile funding.
Mike Williams says the under and overpayments only represent a small percentage of schools' incomes. He says the new system will be a good replacement for decile-based funding because it's based on indicators that appear to be a robust way of targeting children who are at risk of underachievement. For Checkpoint, John Gerritsen.
24 minutes past 6. Let's have some sport. The All Whites coach, Anthony Hudson, has stepped down after the team failed to reach the 2018 Football World Cup in Russia. Hudson had been in charge of the All Whites for more than 3 years, taking them to the Confederations Cup in Russia this year and reaching the final qualifying stage of the World Cup before falling short against Peru last week. That 0-0 draw in Wellington, of course, before that. Our football reporter, Clay Wilson, has covered the majority of Hudson's tenure, and I asked him if it's a surprise that he's leaving.
Not really, no. I think it all rode on if we were going to qualify for the World Cup. He's been linked with a number of jobs throughout the last probably 12 months in the UK, most recently in the US. It looks like that's potentially what might happen.
Which will pay better, right?
Yeah, and also the other element is more games. It's obviously he hasn't always been happy with the amount of games, and it's just the nature of where we are in the world that the All Whites don't get a lot of games. Right until the end of their World Cup qualifying, I guess they get more games, but with a club job, obviously he's going to get a lot more games and a lot more consistency, and he's a football man. He wants to be coaching. And
yeah, absolutely. If you got a UK club coaching job, how many games would he have a season roughly?
30, 40,
yeah, right,
50.
Okay.
They play a lot of games.
Yeah,
the All Whites sometimes 3, 4, 5 games a year, so
Yeah.
it's a big difference. Yeah.
What was he like as a coach? My sense was, particularly in the beginning of both games against Peru, there was a little bit of that stuff we see from the Phoenix, which is you just get the ball at the back, you kick long and you hope for the best up the front. Was he imaginative or was he working a formula?
I think he always was, but sometimes necessarily the players he had weren't perhaps capable of that. He was building towards that, but when you're playing against these top teams and you are New Zealand and the players, the difference in quality is so big. I guess you've got to hedge your bets a little bit. They were playing a little bit of that traditional style, lump it forward, but they're also trying to play at times. But of course, with that comes risk. When you play with the ball, you lose the ball, you turn it over.
Yeah.
So I think we did see a little bit of that. Perhaps more so as we got on, but against the bigger teams, not so much, because it's just the nature of playing against those big teams. The quality between the two sets of players is so vast.
So the poor All Whites, they get hardly any games. They're dispersed far and wide around the world, and now they don't even have a coach. What's next for them, and who will coach them, do you think?
Who knows? That's anyone's guess. There's not an obvious candidate or candidates even. Locally, you would perhaps say Danny Hayes' name's been thrown in the mix, the former captain. He's very lukewarm on whether he wants to do it. Whether he's had enough experience is probably a question. A very nice guy and a great up-and-coming coach. I would say it's probably going to come from overseas, but they won't be in any rush, basically because they don't have any games. There's no scheduled games for the All Whites, and their World Cup qualifying won't start.
Sorry, I just want you to repeat that phrase. There are no scheduled games for the All Whites, none?
No, none. They're saying that they're in talks with people and they've got people wanting to play games against them. But the thing is, these are expensive games. New Zealand football is probably not going to have as much money to spend on the All Whites over this next cycle, perhaps the next 2 or 3 years. So who knows what's going to happen? I would say, I think it's been perhaps 6 or 8 months, the last 2 times we've lost a coach before a new coach has been appointed. So we could be waiting a while, hopefully not that long this time around. But yeah, whether that'll be someone from here or overseas, I would say perhaps overseas, but they're going to cast the net pretty wide, I would have thought. Yeah.
Gosh, it's tough in New Zealand football, isn't it? And that's why it's hard to retain players in the country, isn't it? Let's talk about basketball. There's an international in New Zealand tonight, right? The South Koreans are here in Wellington. How often does that happen? Well,
Tall Blacks don't get games here very often at all, but they're going to get more. So what this is the Tall Blacks have now moved into the Oceania Confederation, has moved into Asia. So it's sort of been dissolved into Asia, and this is the start, I guess, of their path to World Cup qualifying for 2019. So that's in China. It starts here, so they start in a group of 4, and then they go into, hopefully progress into a further group, and then eventually qualify for the World Cup. So it means a lot more home games for the Tall Blacks. They'll be obviously rapt about that, and basketball fans, because they don't get to see much of them that often. So I guess we'll see. They lost to South Korea twice at the Asia Cup recently, which is their first sort of taste of Asia. 2 close losses, but
and both up there, weren't they? Both up.
No, so the World Cup was in Lebanon. I think.
Okay, yeah. So away games.
They played them once in the group play and once in I think the playoff of 3rd and 4th, and lost. So it'll be a pretty decent game, I would have thought, and the Tall Blacks side, I guess, without Stephen Adams, but still with some and obviously the break is going very well and a number of players from there. So we'll see, but I think a lot of basketball fans and just casual sports fans are quite excited to see the Tall Blacks back playing on New Zealand soil.
Clay Wilson, our excellent sports reporter, wearing a very fitting T-shirt. We're just going to show you the control room and you'll be able to see that. Look at that. We got a 3-for-1 deal on those. Very smart T-shirts. Lots of feedback tonight. Dear John, I don't want this broadcast, but I'm a nurse. We're not going to tell you what the nurse said, but it did sound like something really important. But she can't do it because her DHB's purse strings are pulled so tight. Then I hear about this dick in the Waikato spending unbelievable amounts of money on a lavish life. Gosh, it makes me cross. John, you're so clever. The list of Nigel Murray sounds for me exactly what we'll be hearing of when the America's Cup shindig hits Auckland. All our councillors, all their distinguished guests, all of Auckland's elite, all of Auckland's wealthy elite will be whining and dining themselves at the public trough. Cheers, Chris. Cheers to you all for your feedback, and thank you for being with us. We'll be back tomorrow at 5.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The Supreme Court has ruled WorkSafe's decision not to prosecute the Pike River mine boss Peter Whittle over the deaths of 29 men was unlawful. However, he won't face further court action because too much time has passed. A senior police officer acquitted on kidnapping charges says he was trying to help a young Māori boy onto a better path. Auckland councillors have chosen a compromise option for creating an America's Cup village spreading bases over 3 wharves. And the whole of Taupō has been without power because of a fault at the Transpower station in Wairake. Our next news and weather is at 7.
The new TPP is still breathing, but will it ever fully recover?
If it's not done by the end of the year, then I hope it can be signed as quickly as possible. I worry a little.
Will Asia finally buy in without the world's biggest economy, the United States?
Unfortunately for President Trump,